that Merav has been able to join us. Yay!
Yes, I'm so sorry
Where
about
is
that.
she?
No,
oh,
we're
there she is.
Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you for waiting for me. Hopefully everyone is still here.
Well, I was going to
So.
give the talk, but you know, it's just not the same.
Well, you could do it. You could definitely do it. And
I don't have
think
the
that'll be fun.
slides.
What are you actually doing here, Paul? I'm surprised.
Well, listen to you.
That's awesome.
I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah, I know. And hi, everyone else. I probably met some of you a while back when we did the insect walk.
Yes.
That was so much fun. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, unfortunately now it's all about Zoom. It was much more fun to do things in person. Even though for presentations, this is actually pretty good. So I enjoy giving like Zoom presentations. I think they work well, but otherwise, I think everything else is so much nicer in person. But yeah.
You want it louder?
A little bit.
So yeah, I hope everyone is doing well.
That's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, Merav doesn't need any introduction to this group. We all are big fans, all from Edgewood and from Friends of Hutter and Wonderlic Park. So unfortunately for us at the Friends, we had 2 events with Merav that we had to cancel in the last year. So I'm super excited that we're finally able to have you back, even if it's not in person. And I want to thank you for being generous with your time with us, and welcome everyone. And I'll turn it over to Merav. Just maybe mute yourself unless you have a question or something like that. But otherwise, let's just dig into the social lives of ants. I'm so excited.
Yes, I'm sorry, it will take me one more second. I have some technical issues here. So, sorry, I'll get there. Yeah, I'm not on top of it, but I will be in like 2 minutes because ants are my favorite subject. So, you know, as soon as we'll get started, this is going to be fun. I just need to make sure I've got the right thing. So, sorry. 2 more minutes. I'm sorry. I know it's already late, very late.
No worries. We had a hard time coming up with what topic to have you present to us because you're such an expert on so many different things, and there's so many fun things to learn about in all of our areas. So, but I'm glad this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart. Yes.
So I actually did my PhD studying ants. I studied invasive ants and their impact on native fauna. And then I did something similar. So that was back in Israel, where I'm from. And then I did something kind of similar here when I came to do a postdoc at Stanford, studying ants. And that was really fun too. So I studied Argentine ants and their impact on the native species in the Bay Area. That was awesome. And yeah, unfortunately now I don't do like real active research with ants, but they are still my favorite, critters. So I enjoy watching them. And I also do a really fun project with Jasper Ridge. So that's where I met Paul. I think that's where we met, right?
Yes, that is correct. Doing the ant survey.
Yes, and I think, maybe you could join us once things are back to normal. Who knows when that would be even.
Well, I'm figuring we do get the spring one. We had the fall one, so why not let us out for that?
Yeah, no, but like in a normal way. Okay, so let me share my screen. Oh, I can't share my screen. Please enable screen sharing. Are we good? Yes. Okay. So let me know if you can see my presentation. I'll put this thing here. Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk about ants. And please feel like this is a discussion, you know. I'd be happy to answer any questions as we go. We don't need to wait till the end. This is a small group, and I think the best thing about these presentations is that it should be interactive, and if you have a question, I'm happy to answer it. If you'd like to type it in the chat, then maybe I'll ask him to kind of, you know, watch out at the chat. Thank you. Otherwise, you know, we could also do like some questions and answers at the end. Okay, so I think this slide kind of has all the answers why I like ants, because they do so many different things, and because they have different functions in different ecosystems. So ants disperse seeds, and they eat lots of different things. They love aphids and scale insects and those things. And by the way, these are just like buzzwords that I'll mention later. Okay, so if you're not familiar with any of them, we'll get there. Some ants even pollinate flowers. Some ants are food for lots of different predators, and they eat weird things. They'll eat dead stuff too. So that mouse there, it's only like a little piece of it that we found in Jasper Ridge on the ant survey, and the ant, like 3 different species of ants were feeding on it. But anyway, let's get started. So how many ant species do you think are there? Well, if you ask people, they might say 1, you know, they all look just the same. Or some people would say, oh, there are 2, you know, there's the red ones and the black ones. And, you know, that's kind of it. But actually there are like at least 12,000 different ant species worldwide. And this map will show you like where we know we have higher numbers of species. In California, we know about 280 ant species. And there might be a few more that we don't know about, but probably this is, you know, pretty good information, because we do have 2 ant taxonomists in the state, which is awesome. And quite a few ant researchers. Of course, in other places around the world, we don't have that much information. Okay, so when we look at an ant body structure, then what do we see? Okay, ants are insects, so they have 3 different body parts. They have their head and the thorax and the abdomen. You probably know that stuff. But ants, so different insects have different mouth parts. Ants have mandibles. I mean, well, they all have mandibles, but ants have these mandibles that are chewing mouth parts. And that's what they use to do all their work. Unlike, you know, on all these Disney movies and stuff, they don't use their hands. They can't do anything with their hands other than walk. So they use the mandibles. And if they have big mandibles, it means that they work hard, or in this case, they just bite really hard. But usually it means that they work hard. And if they have tiny, tiny, tiny mandibles, it means like they probably don't need to do much. So the queen or the king, actually, well, not the king, sorry, the male ant usually has tiny, tiny, tiny mandibles because they do nothing. But the worker ants will usually have larger mandibles. Of course, there'll be differences between species. And that's the other reason why I really like ants, because there are so many different species and they're so diverse. Different species have different strategies how to do different things, and that will affect their body shape. Okay, so some species will have a sting or a stinger at the end of the abdomen, like this species probably, and others don't. And I think we might mention that later. All ants, by the way, so sometimes even ant expert will have a difficulty telling if something is an ant or not. Because we have some spiders that mimic ants, and those are just awesome. And they're actually common in the area, like in Jasper Ridge, which is right next to you in Hadot. We often find jumping spiders that mimic ants, and it takes us a little while to, it's like, which ant is that? Oh, no, it's that spider. So, you know, it takes a little while. And some insects mimic ants. And the reason to mimic ants is because, you know, they're so powerful. So if you mess up with one ant, usually they'll call all their friends, right? All the sisters. So then you're in trouble. So some insects and spiders would try and look like ants. And I guess the best way to tell, I mean, other than something that looks like an ant, is that real ants have this area. They have epithelial, like a little segment between the thorax and the abdomen, and sometimes they'll have two of them. I mean, they look different in different groups of ants, but they all have something there between the thorax and the abdomen. By the way, not all ants have eyes, or eyes that we could see. So this species has big, large eyes. Probably they're predators, so they need to see their prey. Many other species, they have very small eyes or no eyes at all. Okay, and when we look at the morphology, then like further on, so we could see that male ants and queens, they usually start with wings. Not all of them, but usually they'll have wings on, and then later on they'll take off their wings, and the worker ants will never have any wings on. Okay, speaking about queens, then different ant species have different, again, like they're very diverse. So some species have just one queen in the nest. Okay, they're called monogyny ants. And then other species could have many different queens. Like the Argentine ant that I mentioned, which is the most common non-native species in our area, they can have many queens in their nest, and they all reproduce, they're all laying eggs. At the same time, they could have millions of workers in one nest or one big colony. So in this case, this is a different species with lots of different queens. When we look at the workers themselves, then they could look different as well. So in some species, like this little fire ant that I studied for my PhD, all the workers are exactly the same size in the same colony, and they all look the same. Other species might have like a whole range of worker size, like the red imported fire ant from southeastern United States. So you'll have tiny workers and large workers and everything in between. And they all look basically the same. I mean, very similar body shape, just, you know, different size. And then this other category is really interesting because they have only two different categories. This is called the big-headed ant. You know, it's a good common name, I think, because most of the workers look like this one. Okay, they're pretty small, but some of them have a huge head. Okay, so these are the big-headed ants, and it's a huge genus. They have thousands of workers worldwide, of species worldwide, that all have this. And in California, we actually have a kind of common species, but they're really, really tiny and kind of yellowish orange, very difficult to find because they have a tiny nest with tiny workers, the same color of the soil. But we do find them in Jasper Ridge. They're probably found in Hodot as well. Okay, and now let's look at their life cycle. So they have this life cycle that is kind of similar to a butterfly life cycle with complete metamorphosis. So from an egg to a larva that looks like a little white blob, and then to a pupa, which also looks like a little white blob, but you could see their adult organs like inside. And then from the pupa, you could get usually workers, which are all females, by the way, or males, or queens. So the males are males, obviously. The queens are also females, just like the workers. And there's like this whole story, how do they decide whether it's a queen or a female or a male, which is really interesting. Maybe if we'll have time for that, we could talk about that at the end. And by the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. As I said, I mean, I'm really happy to talk more about something or to answer any questions you have. Because like each one of these slides, I could just spend, you know, forever just talking about this. Because like this is really cool. And ants are so awesome. Okay, so one thing is the colony reproduction, okay, which is this slide. So the queen laying lots of eggs to become workers. At some point when the nest grows big enough. And some studies show that, you know, in specific ants, once they reach maturity, so in the red harvester ants in Arizona, that takes about 5 years to reach, I think, about 5,000 workers in one colony. So these are pretty large ants that live for a long time. Then at that point, the colony needs to reproduce, okay? Because usually, is there a question? Okay, so usually,
Okay.
what's that? Okay, so usually the queen only lays eggs that would become workers, okay, with no new queens or new males. But once the nest reaches maturity, then the nest needs to reproduce, okay, to create new nests. And then how do they do that, okay, to create new nests around? So they have a few different strategies. I mean, first, the queen needs to start laying eggs that would become queens and males. And then depending on the ant species, most ants go through a nuptial flight. And this is the best time of the year to talk about that, because you might notice that after the first rain, but it's not just the first rain, it's a few different rain events, that ants from different colonies go out and try and find each other. So unfortunately, they don't have, you know, social media or emails or anything like that, but they need to time the nuptial flight somehow. And the way to do it is to go right after the first rain event, or right after the first really hot and dry day of the year. You know, like different species would use different events to go out and meet each other. So once they do, they all go out flying. Queens and males from hopefully different nests try to meet each other and mate. And at this point, and you can see like a little male mating with a big winter ant queen here. Once they mate, the male is done, okay? It's like done with everything it was supposed to do. You can see it's very small. It doesn't have that much energy reserves and stuff. The queen, on the other hand, is just starting a real task. So both the queen and the male, they have this big thorax because they have all the flight muscles inside. But the queen also has pretty large abdomen, or we call it guster, where she's going to lay all her eggs from. Many queens also have pretty large eyes, just like the male, but large mandibles, because she's going to need to do all the work now. I'm not sure exactly actually how it works in winter ants, so how about I'll talk about this species, because I think here it's more clear. So what this one, which is a harvester ant, what they do is after they mate, the queens break off their wings, because now they're done, they're not going to fly anywhere else. And then they start a new nest. So they'll dig a little bit in the ground. If they fly right after the first rain, then it's pretty easy because the soil is kind of wet and easy to dig. And then they start raising the first generation of workers. But think about it, if they go out, if the queen that, you know, dug a little nest and is hiding in there, if she goes out and a lizard would eat it, then that's the end of it. That's the end of that nest. Unlike a regular harvester ant nest that, you know, some workers get lost, they're eaten by predators or whatever, and that's fine. The queen will lay more eggs and she'll have more workers. But in this case, if the queen dies, that's the end of the colony. So in some species like this harvester ant, they have this amazing strategy. So look at that queen. She has this pretty large thorax full of flight muscles. Lots of energy stored there. So what she does is she actually digests the flight muscles, and she leaves over on that protein for a few months. And she would lay the eggs for the first generation of workers, maybe about 10, 15 eggs. And she would feed them and without leaving the nest even once. And then these little workers, they'll be much smaller than what they should be. But they'll go out foraging, they'll bring food, and they'll start, you know, making a nice nest and all that. And then the queen will mostly lay eggs. But until then, she needs to do everything. So, and that's very risky. So it's obviously better if she could stay inside the nest. Another option is that some species, especially non-native species, they use a different strategy called budding, when a few workers will drag some queens out of the nest. And usually there will be species that have many queens. They'll take some of their queens out, and then they'll find a new nest near the other colony. So they don't go too far. Even if they have wings, usually they won't fly, but they'll just, walk a little bit and make another nest that way. And that's pretty interesting too. So yeah, that's a harvester ant queen digging her nest in the ground. And it's a pretty good strategy for us, when we're trying to look for an ant queen for a new colony to keep at home or in the lab. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the ant nest. So unfortunately, most of the ant nests don't look like the cute little cartoon nest that my daughter drew for me. But most of the ant nests around here actually look like this one or that one. I mean, and these are pretty obvious ones, but like our most common ant, the winter ant, basically has a tiny little hole in the ground, and that's it. So when we go out for our ant survey in Jasper Ridge, we usually don't look for the nest because it's so difficult to find. A harvester ant nest like this one on the right is easier to find because they have all, this remains of seeds and stuff that they ate, and they take it all out. And a carpenter ant, Camponotus nest, is also sometimes kind of easy to find if you know what you're looking for. But if you're looking for like a little cartoon nest, then that would be difficult unless you're walking right after the rain, when they're all busy, remodeling and taking all the dirt out. So then you might see something like this one on top, okay? So which kind of looks like what you would expect when you're looking for an ant nest. Inside the nest, if you're lucky to find one, then you might find all sorts of cool things. So all these white blobs, these are the eggs and the larvae. You could see this little larva here, and the eggs would usually be in like little clumps. So same with this species. Because many ants around springtime, when it's not too dry, but they want to grow lots of larvae and eggs and stuff, they would bring everything up. So many nests would be under a rock or something like that, and they would bring all their larvae and eggs and even the queens out right there under the rock. So if you look under a rock, you might find like a whole nest with everything in there. And that's really interesting to see. And they do that because it's a bit warmer. They can detect this slightly difference in temperature between the deep area of the nest and different area right under a rock. So that would help their larvae and eggs and develop faster. And they might use that, and then they would move everything once the conditions change. Other ant species build even more interesting nests. So this little fire ant uses all sorts of little plant material and different things that they find, and then they would put a little bit of larva in there, a few workers, and then they'll have another chamber. So this is like a little seed that they found in the ground, and they use that as a little chamber, and they sealed it with something that looked like a curtain. And then other species build different structures. Some of them use their own larvae to sew. So this is the green ants from Australia, and the ants themselves, they can't make silk, but some species, the larva can. So an adult ant would take a little larva and use it just like a sewing machine, I guess, to connect different parts of the leaf, like this one in the green ant, or to connect different plant materials in this case, to build like a little structure. Because not all ant species nest in the ground. Many of them nest on trees or on different plant structures. So some of them would use these materials, and it's really interesting to see. I think, well, you can't see these things here, but what you can see around here are these awesome twig ants that are not that easy to find, but once you do, they're very awesome. Do you have manzanita bushes, like large yeah, you do? awesome. So manzanita apparently is a great plant to find this twig ant. These cute orange ants. So they're called twig ants because they nest inside twigs. Their nests are not that huge, so they won't have millions of workers, but they could have, you know, a pretty nice size nest, maybe with hundreds of workers, I would guess. I don't think more than that, but maybe. And they use dead parts of the manzanita bush that were emptied by beetle larvae. So after the beetle larvae finished developing and left that area, they leave little chambers, the little tunnels in the plant, and the ants use that. So the way that we found them is looking at manzanita bushes in Jasper Ridge and in other places in the Bay Area. And they kind of not like it when it's nice and hot outside, and that's when you might see them. Sorry. So that's when you might see them, when it's nice and hot outside. They might be more active. In Jasper Ridge, unfortunately, we usually see just one worker. So we always say, oh, it's her again, you know, let's look at her, and then we'll put her back, because we usually don't see more than one. But obviously there's more than one ant in that nest. Anyway, these are really, really cool ants. So, and well, so they don't connect, you know, different plant parts with silk like the other arboreal ants, other ants that nest on trees, but they do use like cavities made by beetles. And this is just an example of an underground nest with chambers. This one made by carpenter ants. And then this is a really awesome story about the leafcutter ants. I don't know if any of you watched that video some years ago. I can send you a link later. But some years ago, someone published this video about excavating a huge leafcutter ant nest. So these are ants that you usually see in the tropics, but also in southern US in some specific parts. And they have huge nests with like millions of workers. And you could see here, so they poured cement from like a little truck for, I think, a whole week to then kind of dig very, very gently around all these different chambers. So these round things, these are chambers where the ants used to be. Now it's full of cement. And then these are the trails that connected them. And it took them, I don't remember how many days to excavate all that soil out. But this is amazing. I'll share the link with you later. So just to try and figure out what an ant nest looks like from the inside, you know, and it's huge. It's just a huge structure. But when you have this resource, you have an ant nest with all the food and, you know, all the stuff in there, then this is a really good place for, you know, other organisms to take advantage. So one thing that ants do is obviously to sting. Some of them have a stinger at the end of the abdomen with venom. So ants are related to wasps and bees. They all belong to the same order of insect, the Hymenoptera. So their venom could be, you know, depending on the species, painful or not painful, or, you know, a little bit painful or very painful, depending on the species. But it could also create an allergic reaction, just like bees do. So, and that is a huge problem in places that have a big problem with invasive species that sting people and then create an allergic reaction. So yeah, the sting actually evolved from the oviduct, where they used to lay eggs, but it's not used for that anymore. Okay. So, but only some ants sting. Other ants, so we divide ants into subfamilies. So some of these subfamilies, some of these groups, they lost their sting. They're actually the more progressed, evolved ants. They don't have a stinger anymore. What they would do instead, like this carpenter ant, if they're big enough, they might try to bite you and then spray formic acid on it. Okay, so and they could get so big that they would actually be able to pierce your skin in your finger. It's not that bad. It's just, you know, slightly uncomfortable when you're trying to take a photo, but at least they hold still. So it is a good thing. Okay. In their nest, as I said, there could be so many different individuals and they need to communicate with each other. And they have really interesting ways to communicate. So they use antenation, moving their antenna, and tapping and grasping and nudging and, you know, doing all sorts of things. And they use many different chemical compounds to communicate. Okay, so one way is when they do trophallaxis. If you watch ants closely, you might see that they not only antenate, but sometimes it looks like they're kissing. So they might be kissing, but while they do that, they also feed each other with some food. So not all ants go out foraging. Some of them stay in the nest most of the time. And ants from the outside will bring back food in their crop. And then they'll take that food out and feed the other ant. But with the food, they also deliver all sorts of chemical compounds, all sorts of pheromones. And that way, they regulate many different things in the nest. So for example, a queen might say, I'm the queen, no need for another queen. I'm the queen, you know, and if the nest is not too big, then that message will go through the entire nest and everybody will hear that the queen is here, you know, long live the queen. But once the nest gets a little bit too big and not everyone gets that message, they might decide, oh, you know what, we might need another queen. So they could take some of her eggs and instead of, or some of the larvae, and instead of saying, okay, these are going to be workers, we need to stop feeding them because they're getting a little bit too big, they'll keep feeding them, or they'll feed them with better food, just like bees do, and give the queen to bee a better food. Then some ants do the same thing. So yeah, so that's one message. Another message could be where we have ants that have larger workers that we sometimes call soldiers. They, these soldiers keep saying, or sending this message, we've got enough soldiers, no need for more. But once they die, or, you know, someone would eat them, then we have less of that pheromone in the colony. And that's when the other ants will say, oh, we need more soldiers. So that's how you get messages out, even though there's nobody rules the nest, you know, the queen doesn't tell anyone what to do. It's all a self-regulated system, which is very, very interesting. And these are some of the glands that the ants have. So each of these glands, they produce different pheromones, and some of the pheromones are actually composed of different glands secretions. So together they create a very, very interesting language that, you know, it's pretty difficult for us to understand, but some of it we do understand because there have been some really interesting studies about these pheromones and the way they use. And again, there could be, you know, like a whole class, university class about this subject, but it's really interesting. And if you have specific questions about that, we could talk about that at the end. Any questions so far, by the way? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about eusocial insects, because that's a really interesting topic as well. So eusocial insects are ants and a few other insects that I'll mention in a minute. But what it actually means is that we have cooperative brood care. So brood are the eggs and larvae of the ants. And in eusocial insects, they all take care of their youngs together. Okay, or not all of them, but they do take care of them together. It's not just I take care of my kids. We have overlapping generations, which means that, you know, more than one generation lives in the nest at the same time, and the division of labor. We have a reproduction cast. We have the queen that is usually the only one reproducing, and then we have the workers that do all the work. But it's even more complex than that, because even in the worker caste, we have different groups of workers doing different tasks. And then who are the eusocial insects? So all the ant species, again, over 12,000 species, some of the bees. So you probably know that the honeybee is eusocial bee. So they have a nest or a hive with a queen and all that. But we have thousands of solitary bees, bees that don't live in a nest like that. Most of our native bees are like that. And then some of the wasps are eusocial, some are not. Like you probably know yellow jackets and everyone's favorite wasp. But there are lots of solitary wasps and some social ones. And then all the termites, which are not related to ants. They're actually related to cockroaches. They're like social cockroaches. So all termites are eusocial. And very similar to ants in the way that the communities work, but just completely unrelated, which is very interesting. Some of the beetles, aphids, crustaceans are eusocial, but that's not very common in these groups. And then even 2 species of mammals are eusocial, the naked mole rat and his cousin. Okay. So any questions about that before we talk about ant diet?
Merav,
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
I saw
Sure.
Tom may have had a question. Tom, did you have a question? Oh. Okay, I don't think so.
Okay, so maybe at the end. Okay, so most ants are omnivores. They eat everything. Okay, they'll eat your candy, they will eat your cookies, they'll eat your tuna fish, they'll eat anything. But some species are more specialized and they'll have more specific requirements. So some are predators, usually of other arthropods. Some specialize on seeds. Some specialize on fruits or nectar. Many ants like nectar anyway, but some would specialize on that. And then almost all species use honeydew to some degree, and I'll explain what that is. So you probably are familiar with aphids and scale insects. So these are little true bugs, little insects that feed on plant sap. So they have specialized mouth parts and they suck the plant sap out of the plant. And because just like anyone else, they need proteins in order to develop. They can't just, well, the plant sap is very rich with sugar and kind of poor in protein. So they need to keep feeding. And while they keep feeding, they secrete most of that sugars out in what we call honeydew. And ants learned how to use that. And from the aphids, millions of years before we invented or thought we invented agriculture. So they use aphids like we use cows. They, some species got it into a very sophisticated relationship. So they would take care of the aphids. They'll protect them from the natural predators like wasps and other predators. Sometimes they'll build specialized structures for them, like little farmhouses. They might take them into the nests in the winter or move them from one plant to another. And in return, the aphids provide them with honeydew, which is great food source for the adult ants. So most ants would use honeydew in one way or another. Not all of them will build structures and do sophisticated stuff, but many of them do that. And that's, by the way, a very good way to find ants. So when we look for ants, we often look for aphids, especially in the spring when we have all this new growth and the tons of aphids everywhere in the field. Then I often tell people, look for aphids and then you'll find ants, because the ants will find these aphids and take care of them.
So Merav, Carol is asking if, is honeydew the secretions of aphids?
Yes.
And do any other insects produce honeydew?
So it's aphids and scale insects and all these, even some cicadas and everything related to that. Many insects that feed on plant sap and need to get rid of it. If other insects produce honeydew, I'm not sure. Paul, what do you think? Am I missing something?
Yeah, caterpillars,
Oh,
the
yeah.
blues and the
Uh-huh.
hair streaks. I was just going to put that in, but I don't have to anymore.
Yes, you're right. So they produce honeydew as well, and the ants, of course, learned how to do that. And of course, they actually do that so that the ants would take care of them. So ants would take these caterpillars to the nest and protect them, and will get honeydew for that. So, okay. So some ants are actually specialized predators and would feed on, like, specialize on centipedes, like this species. And then they have, like this one will have this sting. And by the way, this is a blind ant. So there are cryptic ants, they live underground and forage underground. So they don't really need eyes. They have no use for them. And again, many ants specialize in seeds. So ants are very good seed dispersals. They're actually the most important seed dispersal in California serpentine grasslands. They're very important in dispersing the seeds of our annual plants. Unfortunately, they're also very sensitive to the invasion of the Argentine ant in Jasper Ridge, for example. So that could be a big problem for our serpentine grasslands at some point. It's kind of easy to store seeds, right? I mean, it sounds kind of easy. It's not that easy, but you could store seeds in your nest. You obviously need to make sure that they won't sprout or mold or anything like that. So ants could detect like slightly differences in temperature and humidity and move the seeds from one chamber to another to make sure that they would be stored well. But it's pretty awesome when you could find like a little cache of seeds in your nest. And then some ants feed mostly on liquid food. If it's honeydew or something like that, then they need to store that food as well. And the honeypot ants in Arizona, they have specialized workers that can store all that liquid food in their abdomen. So that little pot here, it's actually an ant abdomen. And these are the segments here. Okay, it's just got stretched so much. We have a local ant that does something kind of similar. So we have what is called the little honeypot ant or the winter ant, which is very, very common here. And they don't look as impressive as this, but they also have specialized workers that have a larger abdomen. They look more like this worker here. Okay, so not as huge, but still pretty nice. And they can store the liquid food in there for the entire colony to enjoy. But ants do other weird things, and I'd like to mention a few of them. So other than agriculture, they also invented slavery many millions of years ago. And for example, this species, and we have some species, I think not right here, but like in around Tahoe, I think you could see different species, and in Arizona, obviously, I saw some, but there are a few species in California as well. What they do is they use that chemical communication that I mentioned. So they produce pheromones that instead of, so when they try to invade another ant's nest, they would make them disperse, so escape and run away instead of protecting their colony. All the other species workers would just escape, which will make it easier for them to then enter that nest and raid it. So they will take larvae and pupa of the other species, and they might even take some of their food or their workers that store food in them. And then they will take all that stuff back to their nest. And this is always a very closely related species. so often from the same genus, a closely related species that have kind of similar pheromones, but not exactly the same. They will take them back to the nest, and then the workers that will come out of those larvae and pupa mostly will be their slaves. They would take care of the other ant nest. They will take care of their queen and their eggs and their larvae until they run out of them, and then they'll have to go back and steal some more. But that's a really interesting strategy. And it's interesting because sometimes you could actually see that. So this is a species you could see here in the United States. And really interesting. So you could see, by the way, remember I mentioned that they work with the mandibles. So look at these weird mandibles. If you remember what we saw before, usually they have teeth and stuff like that. So it will be easier to hold on to soil or food or something like that. Here it's mostly just to capture other ants. So yeah, really interesting. And then just a little bit about our Bay Area ants. We won't get too much into that because it's getting late. But just a little bit to show you that we have beautiful diversity of ants here, and there's lots of stuff to see. So for example, we have our own harvester ants, okay? We mostly have the black harvester ant here, but in some areas we do have red harvester ants that belong to a different genus. This is the winter ant that I mentioned a few times. So these are the ants that can store liquid food in the abdomen, and they're also very, very common. The other interesting thing about them is that they are somewhat resistant to the invasion of the Argentine ants. So the Argentine ant, that invasive species that I mentioned, the biggest problem with them is that when they invade a habitat, they displace, they kill all the other ant species, and then this is usually the only ant species you'd see. But then often you'll also see winter ants. So you'll see 2 species, other than 10, 15 different species that were supposed to be in that habitat. And we see that in Jasper Ridge in some places. We have these awesome ants that are called velvety tree ants that I actually have in my front yard, but usually you see them in the forest on trees. These are also arboreal ants, so they nest on big oaks usually. Our biggest ants in the area are the carpenter ants, Camponotus. We have a few different species. They're all pretty large. These are the ones that would bite you and then spray formic acid. They don't sting. And I mean, none of these ants are actually aggressive. Even these ants, in order to bite you, you actually have to hold them with 2 fingers and, you know, make them pretty upset. Otherwise, most of these ants would just ignore you. This is the twig ant that I mentioned. And this is the field ant. So field ants are also pretty common ants in a forest and natural habitat. It's called formica. And this one is tending galls. So you just talked about galls a few weeks ago, right? So some galls actually produce honeydew to protect ants, to attract ants, because then if ants and sometimes yellow jackets are, you know, buzzing around and walking around the galls, then it will be more difficult for the natural predators of the gall inducer, the little wasp sitting inside, is more likely to finish its cycle without anyone parasitizing it, because there are lots of parasitic wasps that would try and get the little baby wasp inside. So the gall is actually producing honeydew to attract ants and wasps. So this ant is taking care of that honeydew.
Rob, Carolyn would like to know, do ants induce any gall production?
Not that I know. No. So some plants, not around here, but like in the tropics, there are different plants that grow specific structures for the ants. But as far as I know, they would grow these structures regardless of the ants. So the ants don't need to induce that. It's something that evolved in the plant, and they would do that even if you grow them at home without any ants. So they will grow little structures where the ants could make the nest. They will grow protein bodies to feed the ants. depending on the species, they might grow extra floral nectaries to provide them with sugars. But yeah, but it's regardless of the ants' activity, it will be there anyway. But they are inviting ants to move in and protect them, which is just awesome. Okay, so yeah, I want to talk a little bit about a few species. Do we have time for that? Would that be okay?
That's great.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. So yeah, just very few species. So the Argentine ant, I mentioned it because this is a really important species. It's the most common non-native. You see it everywhere you go in the Bay Area. We see it in probably in your kitchen if you have ants. These are probably the Argentine ants, even though, I mean, it might be a few species, but most likely the Argentine ant. Many people will have them in their yard. When you go hiking, unfortunately, you are very likely to see them because they're so common. They arrived to California over 110 years ago and have been spreading since. They affect almost all other ant species in the area and displace, well, as far as we know, they affect many of them and displace many of these native species. And if you remember, I mentioned that our native ants, they disperse seeds, they feed on nectar, they have different jobs, you know, different parts in the ecosystem. So once you displace them with just one species that is very generalist, then you really change the way the ants interact with that ecosystem. So it might have additional impacts, which is why I think invasive ants are so interesting. And I studied them for many years. Another interesting invasive ant is the immigrant pavement ant, which is very common, not in natural habitats, but it's actually very common in urban settings. So often if you go for a walk in your neighborhood and you see tons of ants on the pavement, these are probably pavement ants fighting. So for some reason, they fight each other very often. And if you look closely, you'll see these kind of elongated ants, dark brown, biting each other, fighting each other, like the same colonies of the same species, okay? Different colonies of pavement ants will fight each other. And this is very interesting and not a common thing to see with other ants. But, you know, if you look for ants, then you might notice that. Okay, and just a little bit about where you could find ants, because hopefully now you really want to go and find some ants. So you need to look at the right place, obviously. So one good place is to look where you find aphids. So in this photo, you actually have a different gall here, but this is a willow with some galls and some field ants tending these aphids. The gall is not a part of this thing, but yeah, anyway, looking for aphids. So if you have different plants that you know that have aphids, if you go out for a hike, you could look for Italian thistle, for example, in the spring has tons of aphids and lots of ants often. And yeah, just think about plants that have aphids. And then some plants have extra floral nectaries. Like, oh, I'm blinking about the name of this. This is like a vetch. I think it's a vetch or something like that. So they have vetch, right? Okay, thanks. And coyote brush. So coyote brush is an awesome plant to look for ants. You could find quite a few species on one bush because it has extra floral nectaries. So these are little places where the plant produces nectar to attract ants, to protect it from all sorts of herbivores. Okay, because the ants present, they might remove all sorts of little things that would eat that plant. Another great plant is coast live oak, probably the most common tree around here, is a really awesome plant for ants. So you could look at the leaves, you could look at just the tree trunk, you might see ants going up and down. So that's a really good place to look. And then, yeah, so we said oaks, caddybrush, and annual plants, especially if they have aphids on them. And I guess I have this slide just because I really like the picture. So Argentine ants on the passion fruit flower. And then another awesome way is to use baits. So baits are like the easiest way to find ants. If you feel like you don't know if you have any ants around, even around your home, but it could also be something you could do as a docent. When you take people out for a walk, you could place some baits, and it takes ants between 5 to 15 minutes or maybe 30 minutes to find the baits, depending on the species you're aiming for. In these pictures, I used sugar water that I prepared for hummingbirds. So the same ratio, I think it's 1 to 4 or something like that. And you could just put it on clear paper, and then it's just easy to see the ants, and also very easy to take photos because they're busy. So, they're not going anywhere and you can take photos, but also you have the background. So it makes it much easier to take photos. And you might find species that you didn't see before because it takes some practice to learn how to find ants, and this way you attract them to you, and you could watch it like over time, and you could put different kind of baits. You could put tuna fish and cookies, you could put whatever you had in your sandwich, and you could watch the ants, but remember that it takes them very quickly. I mean, they'll find a bait very, very quickly, depending on the species. But that's a pretty fun thing to do. And then when you try to identify ants, then you could try and think about the habitat they're in, and if they make trails or not, if they walk fast or slowly, and if they smell. So unfortunately, you're not right here next to me, because if you would be, I'd take a little ant and squeeze it very gently. You don't need to kill them. You just squeeze them a little bit to make them kind of upset. And then some ants would release their alarm pheromone. And depending on the species, like this one, the velvety tree ant, smells very sweet. So it's a very good way to tell it's that species. There are a few species that smells very sweet. So, and it's just kind of awesome to let people smell ants. So, yeah. And then there are lots of different resources you could use to learn more about ants. You could use iNaturalist. You could join our awesome Jasper Ridge Ant Survey. If anyone have questions about that, I could tell you a bit more about that. I'll show you my ant flyer in a second. I could send you a link for that. You could download it and print it. This is the ant flyer. So it has obviously not every ants we have here, but some of our more common species, some of the non-native ants, and quite a few of the native ants with their size, and yeah. And I think I have a better version than that. So I'll share the link to my website with you, and then you could download it from there. Okay. And I think now I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
While people are thinking of their questions, there were a few in the chat that I wanted to go back to.
Just a second before we do that, should I stop sharing so we could see everyone, or should I leave the presentation because we have questions about it? What do you think?
I think stop sharing so we can see each other. Okay. That's nice.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Awesome.
So Carol wanted to know if there are any ants in Antarctica, and she had a great joke about it being named after them.
I think that's an awesome question. And I'm not sure. I mean, there are some research stations there, so they might have something in the research station. I can't remember.
Fair enough.
I don't think there are any native to it.
No native ants, yes. But I wonder if there's some non-natives in the research station or something like that, because there could be.
Probably Argentine ants.
Yeah. Yeah, some invasive, like worldwide invasive species, maybe.
And Emily asked, going back to when they're egg stage, she's saying, so whether a particular egg turns into a worker, a male, or a queen bee depends on not the egg itself, but how it is cared for or fed after it's been laid?
Yes, I'm sorry if I was a bit confusing about that. Partly because I didn't want to take too much of our time for that, because it's like a huge thing. So it's all of the above. So, well, first, if it's a male or female, depend on genetics. So ants are weird. They have a very interesting system called haplodiploid reproduction system, which means that females, which are either queens or workers, are product of a fertilized egg, okay, which has 2 copies of their chromosomes, just like us. We have 2 copies of our chromosome, but 2 sets, sorry, not 2 copies, 2 sets of chromosomes. So that's diploid. But ants also lay eggs that are unfertilized, and those only have 1 set of chromosomes called haploid, and those would only become male ants. Okay, so part of the answer is it's genetics. If it's a haploid egg or unfertilized egg, it will be a male. But if it's a fertilized egg, it could be either a queen or a worker. And that would be determined depending on the species. Because in some species, if they feed them with better food, then they might become a queen. And the larva is much larger and they keep feeding them, they might become queens. But in other species, it's also genetics. So these are different eggs. But it's a really, really interesting subject.
Thank you. Another question was from Lynn. Do grease ants appear in the wild? I'm not.
Grease ants?
Yeah, I don't know. Lynn, are you still on the?
Yeah, I've been told that some ants that come into homes are actually after grease, and I just looked it up. And it says, if I can find it really fast, one of the smallest groups of ants, also called thief ants.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, thief ants, actually Paul has them in his kitchen, right? So
well, not in the
ants,
kitchen, they're outside.
okay, I thought it was in your kitchen. So thief ants are tiny, tiny, tiny ants. They're actually related to the red imported fire ant, the one that is making all the mess in southern US. These are tiny ants that mostly feed on other ant species. And they're very common all around the Bay Area. And I forgot what your question was. I just remember.
Oh, so we find them in houses. Or are they also out in nature?
Yeah, so they're mostly out in nature. And I'm not sure if people actually meant these ants or they just call them thief ants. But thief ants, that's the problem with common names, you know, that different people might call different things. But thief ants are tiny, tiny, tiny ants that feed on other ant species. It's a specific genus called Solenopsis.
So Merav, where you were thinking of that thief ant was in the bathroom. I found a queen walking in the bathroom.
yeah, I remember the story.
Yeah, it wasn't in the kitchen.
Okay.
No workers. No workers have been in the kitchen.
Yeah, because that's the thing. They feed on other ants. So, I mean, they probably don't have much to do in your kitchen. Unlike Argentine ants that would enjoy your sugars and stuff.
So a couple more questions. One from Caroline says, we see ants on the leather oak clasping twig galls. What kinds of ants are those most likely?
So, I mean, obviously it's difficult to tell, but the clasping gall wasp, it's this beautiful purple galls, and they also produce honeydew. So they're very attractive to ants. And I've seen both Argentine ants and winter ants visiting them mostly, but probably also field ants would enjoy them. But usually that's what I saw. So it really depends on where you are. And galls are also a good place to take photos of ants because they're kind of busy. So they don't move as fast. So you can try and take some photos and upload them to iNaturalist or send them to me. I'll share my email address with you guys. So I'm happy to try and identify them.
I have a bad story for you guys who do Edgewood. Argentine ants own almost the entire place. I have not seen any field ants in Edgewood. I have only seen one carpenter ant and a few harvester ants. It's pretty bad. So most of them you see are going to be Argentine ants, unless you get lucky.
Yeah, that's too bad. In Jasper Ridge, they're only found in very specific areas. So we have huge areas that have mostly Argentine ants, but then we have the rest of the preserve that has many different native species.
This is one thing that bothers me about Edgewood. I find them way out on the Argentine ants, way out on the Central Ridge, and there's nobody lives within miles of that. What are they doing there? How do they survive? But that's where they are.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I always thought they needed people, but nope, they're way out there.
Maybe the docent take care of them.
I bet. Who's doing that? Who's feeding them? The one thing I can tell all you docents, there's a really awesome colony of carpenter ants on the Serpentine Trail. As you're going along the north side you come off of the Sylvan Trail and you turn onto the Serpentine and you go into the woods. When you go through out to the second opening from the woods, there's a big colony there and it's all nocturnal. They come up at night, thousands of them. It is so cool.
Yeah, so we actually miss quite a lot of the ant activity, right? Because some species are mostly nocturnal, like the carpenter ants. We might see them during the day, but they're mostly active at night.
Well, yeah, we did a couple of hikes, and Jacko Wiki said, "What are these ants I'm seeing in Edgewood? What ants?" So we went out on the night hike. We're a huge trail of them at night, but during the day, all you see is the little openings.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I see a couple of questions here. So what animals eat ants? Yeah, I didn't mention that, but some lizards really like ants. Some of them actually specialize on ants. And I think it's the horned lizard, right?
I know
but,
which lizard locally?
Yeah, so I'm kind of blinking on it, but there are some local lizards that prefer eating ants, and then some that would just eat them randomly. And then different birds would eat ants, and they especially like it when ants go on a nuptial flight, because then you have all these big fat ants flying, and ants don't fly well. It's very easy to spot ants and termites when they fly because they're such bad flyers. They look like little fairies, bouncing up and down. And when they go out of the nest, you'll often see lots of birds and sometimes lizards waiting for them outside because it's like their favorite time of the year. Because these ants are very rich with fats and protein. And I mean, they're really, really good source of food. And I think there was another question here about Argentine ants. What did they eat? Why did they get into people's kitchens? So it's not just their food. Like they are looking for some sugars and some food, but they also probably depend on water. So in Jasper Ridge, for example, we see that they can't get very deep into the preserve, but they are found around the research station and a few other buildings because they probably need water. So they depend on water and hiding in that structure for at least a period of time in the winter when it's too cold and too wet outside for them. And in the summer, sometimes when it's too dry and hot outside. That's when they're looking for like a shelter. But then the rest of the year, they can kind of spread around and get farther deeper into the preserve. And I don't know, did I miss any other questions?
That was all of them in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Oh, I forgot to ask you my favorite question.
how long do you think ants live for? So if anyone want to guess, other than
Workers or
Paul, not Paul.
queens?
5 years?
2 months.
So
Years.
yeah, but then you need to tell me what's your guess for. Is it for the worker, the queen, or the male? Because we have these 3 different categories. So I heard a few months and I heard 5 years. So of course it depends on the species, right? We have so many different species. Different species will have like different strategies and stuff. But for the little species, usually they live for, you know, a few months for the workers and a couple of years for the queens. And then with the big species, like the harvester ants and the carpenter ants, that's where it gets more interesting. So a male would usually live for a few months because they only produce them when they need them. They wait a little bit in the nest and then they're done after the mating. The workers, they usually live for like a year or 2, something like that. They actually start their life cycle. I mean, after they become an adult, they do the most important task, which is taking care of the queen and the eggs inside the nest. Then after a few days or weeks, they'll turn into like taking care of the nest, taking some soil out and stuff. And the last task they would do is go out foraging, because that's where they're most likely to die at some point. And they would live for like a year or 2. The queen, on the other hand, could live for up to 30 years, which
Wow.
I think is just insane. So 30. And during that time, they only mate once or a few times, usually, well, depending on the species, I guess, but usually they will mate once or a few times at the beginning of that cycle, okay? And then they don't mate again. And they continue laying fertilized eggs until they die. So many, many thousands of fertilized eggs. And I think it's just incredible. So anyway, my favorite question to ask people.
So would that queen stay in the same nest the whole time, that queen that lived for 30 years, or would it ever like fly to a new place? Or does it not do that once its eggs have been fertilized?
So once they mate, they remove the wings and they can't fly anymore. So they would stay with the nest, depending on the species. So some species, the queen or a few queens and a few workers might move and make a new nest nearby. But otherwise, in like some of these harvester ants and carpenter ants, it's just one queen and a huge nest, and that's it. And if the queen is gone, well, that's where the interesting part starts. But that's it, because they don't have any other queen, depending on the species. Because again, different species do different things. But in general, yeah. So they don't go away. Sometimes the whole nest would move, by the way. So our black harvester ants that are common in Jasper Ridge and in the area, they tend to move the huge nest with like thousands of workers and tons of seeds and things that they store. Every few months or every year or something, they move their nests, which takes them a long time. And I think it's not very clear why they do it and why they do it so often. But it's a very interesting phenomenon, because other nests might stay in the same place for many years. And if you know, if you have some favorite ant nests, you might see them year after year in the exact same spot, because they usually don't move.
There was something interesting with the field ants. When they were here, I would find them in one area, then they'd move to another, then another. Finally, they moved up to Bob Dodge's place. But they're moving around, it's got to be the same colony. It's like over here, over there, over there.
Yeah, so, they might be moving because they had parasites or something like that in the nest, or they got disturbed too often by Paul.
Or the food ran out. That's what I thought might be happening.
Yeah, some ants would do that. They actually move near their food source, and then they'll move away to a different place.
The greener pasture over there.
Yeah. And that's the thing, if you have Argentine ants at home and you are unhappy with them, which you might be, then disturb them, make them unhappy. And then they might move into your neighbor's kitchen. because if you disturb them too much, they just might go away. I remember doing that a few years ago when we had them.
I killed them all. That's
Yeah, no,
why
now I have only native species, but
yeah, it's
before
cool.
I used to have them in Palo Alto.
You can do it, people. Get rid of your Argentines.
Yeah, just disturb them too much.
Yeah.
They won't like it.
Oh, I killed the queens. I went after them.
Hmm.
You know the thing with the rock? I'd come out in the morning when the sun would shine, the queens would all be on the bottom of the rock. You'd pick it up, put it in the driveway, and then the queens would start dispersing out. Smash them all. Or the other thing is you find where they were nesting, you pour water in, they all come pouring out. When the queens come out, you get them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we allow that kind of language just because Argentine ants are so bad.
Bad ants.
Because we do like our native ants. They're awesome.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the queen needs to know whether she's laying fertilized eggs or unfertilized eggs. How can she tell?
Well, that's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer.
She must have control.
Yeah, so I mean, it's all about pheromones, right? And like knowing when it's time to lay these eggs and when you need to have males in the nest and when you need to have queens. If the queen is gone, so the queen keeps, producing that pheromone, the queen pheromone, saying that she's there. If you remove the queen, then something really interesting happens. The workers, depending on the species, but like in carpenter ants, sometimes the workers would start developing their ovaries. So the queen actually suppressed their ovaries production. And once she's gone, they will start developing their ovaries and they could start laying eggs. But they can't mate. So even if there's a male there, they can't mate and store sperm. So they can only lay unfertilized eggs that would become males. So at the end of a nest's lifetime, when the queen dies, then all they can do is either rear, hopefully some queens from her eggs that were left in the nest, or they could all try and lay eggs that will become new males. And then there's like crazy anarchy in the nest because they all try to lay their own eggs and it becomes very interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of freaky, but interesting. Mm-hmm. It's pretty awesome with wasps as well.
So is the idea that or would it be adaptive purpose of this be that the males that they produce could then go find a queen of some other nest to mate with, and then that genetic material would get carried on? So that's why they would have developed that?
Yeah, exactly. Because they can't mate with that male, right? But the males could hopefully go out and find another queen and yeah. So, I mean, with these ants, because it happens every many years, then I'm not sure they could time it well with other nests. But some wasps, it's probably part of their life cycle that some of the big nasty wasps that we see that are social, they are seasonal. So their nests only live for like one season for the summer or something like that. So by the end of the summer, the queen would die at some point, and then all these workers would try and lay their eggs and produce some males, depending on the settings. But we had that in the lab once. That was pretty intense because they're all fighting each other and yeah. So Paul is showing us his awesome ant book, and there are lots of really good books and great websites.
This is one Merav told me.
Yeah. So yeah, I have a whole bunch of ant books here. I'll share some of these resources with you later, but there's lots of places where you could learn more. This book is great to identify, like if you really want to get into identifying ants anywhere you go in North America, basically. But there are all sorts of local websites that you could find, and I really recommend just using iNaturalist. And if you put baits, it would be easier for you to take good ant photos. So you could use those for identification, or just to look for, what kind of species were found in this area or that area. And the great thing about learning some of these species is that if you travel in many different places around the Bay Area, you might find the same ants or similar ants. You know, you might find, if you learn how to identify a carpenter ant, it doesn't matter much which carpenter it is, carpenter ant, like which species, but you'll know the genus, which is not that difficult to ID. And then it's like, oh, once you get to know a species, you've probably seen that with plants or other things that you're familiar with, then it makes it much more interesting because you already know something about them. And if you'll join us at the Just for Ridge Ant Survey, then we'll teach you. So we do half a day training every season. We do it in the fall and in the spring. And we do half a day training where we'll teach you how to identify ants. And we'll go for a little hike, look for ants, show you how to find them. And then we do the survey itself for half a day. So you'll get to visit Jasper Ridge, which is awesome. So yeah, if you want to join us, just email me. I'll let you in.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for their time tonight. And I really want to thank Merav for sharing this awesome presentation with us. And I certainly learned some really interesting things. And yeah, I will forward all the info that Merav sends my way. And yeah, we'd love to keep coming and doing more things with you. And then we've been having a lot of fun with the two docent groups, kind of putting together some of these docent enrichment events. So if you have topics or speakers that you would be interested in hearing from, I imagine we're going to be doing this virtually for at least the next few months, but we'd be totally open to bringing some more presenters to you if you have anyone that you're particularly interested in. So just let Emily or myself know. And I thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a great holiday season, and hopefully we'll see each other virtually soon and in person not so long after that. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for coming, and I'm so sorry I was late. I'm deeply sorry about
Thank
that.
you, Mel.
Blame it on the traffic, right?
Sure, yes.
Yeah.
Crazy traffic tonight, crazy.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you again, Merav.
Thanks.
Yeah, great to see you, Paul.